All right, good afternoon. I see that people are still trickling in and we welcome you. My name is Professor Meg Rithmeyer. I'm an associate professor at Harvard Business School, and I am the convener of this seminar series on the Chinese economy at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard. Today, we are fortunate to have the co-sponsorship of the Dr. Class Center for Latin American Studies, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. It's called the Dr. Class in Harvard parlance, for a special session on Chinese finance in Latin America with Professor Stephen Kaplan. Before I let Professor Kaplan talk about his new book, let me introduce him very briefly. He's Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. His teaching interests and research interests focus on the frontiers of international and comparative political economy, where he specializes in the political economy of global finance and development, including the rise of China in the Western Hemisphere and Latin American politics. His first book was called Globalization and Austerity Politics in Latin America, and the book itself and the dissertation on which it was based won a number of awards from the American Political Science Association and beyond. And for the last several years, he's been working on this project on Chinese finance in Latin America. The book, which I have here, is called The Rise of Patient Capital, The Political Economy of Chinese Finance in Latin America from Cambridge University Press. And I suppose I shouldn't say this because it's bad for book sales, but it is available for free online to read on Hollis Library. So if you don't want to buy a copy of the book, you can always access Harvard's libraries to download the individual chapters and read them. It's a special opportunity to hear from Professor Kaplan because this localized knowledge of both Latin America and Chinese finance is exceedingly rare. We do have some colleagues across the river, including Kevin Gallagher and others who focused on this, who give blurbs on the back of the book, but we're lucky to have you here. In addition to Professor Kaplan, we have a colleague of mine, Professor Laura Alfaro, to discuss, and I will introduce her to give some discussant comments. She's exceedingly qualified to do so after Stephen gives us a talk on the book. So with that, I will mute myself and welcome Stephen, but just a couple of housekeeping notes. We are live streaming to YouTube, so you can watch this later if somehow you need to go. And after Professor Alfaro's comments and Stephen's response, we will open it up to Q&A. So I encourage you to use the Q&A box at any time to insert your question at any point, and I will be fielding them at the end of the seminar today. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor Kaplan. We're excited to hear about it.
Thank you very much for having me. I am going to share my screen now. So thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here today. And thank you very much to both the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, as well as the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies for hosting me today, along with Meg and Laura as well. So what I'm going to do is basically kind of set up, China's emergence as a global creditor, and then look at how that has impacted Latin America specifically and what we can learn from the Latin American experience as a debtor. So to begin with, if we look at this graph, beginning with the global financial crisis, we see that China increased its global bank lending quite dramatically, whereas prior to the global financial crisis, it was a global creditor that was fairly similar, if you look at the graph, to sort of what Brazil had been doing internationally. But you see as sort of Western financing begins to withdraw following that global financial crisis, China takes the opportunity to increase its own cross-border banking activity, and today is one of the top 5 bank creditors in the world. At the same time that that's happened, we've seen recently that China, and particularly President Xi, has made some bold proclamations, right? Including, making China a leading world power by 2050, blazing a new trail for other developing countries to achieve modernization, and that China offers a new option for other countries who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence, right? So we want to look at what is the role of China's global banking activity in trying to achieve some of these long-run objectives. Here, we can look at the geographic breakdown of China's policy banks, right? So China has both the China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank of China that does a lot of this global financing. And effectively, we can see that much of the cross-border activity is oriented towards the Asia Pacific. But we do see that both sub-Saharan Africa and the Americas account for sort of a large portion of this financing as well. Americas has accounted for about 16 to 17% of this financing. And what we want to be able to do here is look at what we can learn from China's experience as a creditor in the Americas, and not only sort of look at the variation in Latin America based upon China's financing, but also sort of what the implications of that are. So to begin with, in terms of a theoretical framework, I'm looking at sort of the history of mobile capital throughout the globe. And if we look at the history in the political science literature of mobile capital, we see that it focuses on room for states to maneuver, right? How much policy flexibility that states tend to have under financial globalization. An important part of this framework is the Mundell-Fleming trilemma historically, right? Which suggests that in a world of global capital mobility, national governments tend to face a trade-off between macroeconomic policy autonomy and exchange rate stability. Now, a key assumption historically is that capital is private and would thus exit countries when faced with financial instability and currency depreciation that erodes profits. So ultimate capital's exit threat can compel governments to raise interest rates, constrain fiscal expenditures in order to try to re-attract investment. However, I argue when you look at China's capital, it's a patient form of capital. And this changes the basis of the trilemma, right? Because it tends to be state-led financing, and I'm going to argue that it eliminates this capital exit threat to some degree and allows for greater policy maneuverability. Why? Well, China has capital controls that limits its overseas private investment and restricts the ability of residents to invest in financial assets overseas. So there's a minimum of short-run financial connections between China and the rest of the world, and we tend to get more financing that's long-term, infrastructure-oriented financing as a result. So why would we consider China's patient capital to be different from Western capital, right? To some extent, right? If it's, different from Western capital, in what way would it be different? So within the book, I make the following arguments for why China's capital may be different from market-based capital. One, it has a longer maturity structure often, right? Which can be similar to other bilateral lenders, right? But the scale is rather unique, right? China has, particularly starting with the global financial crisis, increased its cross-border lending, as you saw earlier, dramatically, and the scale of state-to-state lending was rather large compared to what other bilateral lenders would do. The average maturity of Chinese loans is 17 years, compared to about 5 years for private creditors. And this reflects the infrastructure-oriented nature of global financing. I also argue that it has a higher risk tolerance, right? Policy bank investors are more likely to stay with their investment through both good and bad times. Why? There's a longer-term strategy of China in terms of using this finance as a way to internationalize its firms, right? By using and employing infrastructure financing, it can also sort of unleash opportunities to gain cheap assets, market shares, improve key logistical skills of its firms, including marketing, distribution, local engineering capabilities as well. And so compared to, right, if we think of even multilateral financing or Western bank financing, often it's very much oriented towards, individual bankable projects. Comparatively, what we often see with Chinese financing is it's oriented towards creating strategic credit spaces to create economic activity in risky environments. Now, of course, risk appetite is not limitless, but policy banks are willing to kind of emerge in the space between traditional commercial banks and development banks in order to try to provide financing and capture market share internationally, right? So in the book, I make the argument that rather than just being about individual profit maximization, often China is trying to use its financing to have market maximization instead, to help capture markets overseas. A good example of even how China's financing, right, might compare to traditional Western financing is oftentimes during downturns, Western financing tends to exit. Comparatively, Chinese financing, because it's coming in to try to take advantage of buying cheap assets, oftentimes what we've seen over the course of the last decade is when there's an economic downturn, such as the global financial crisis, or in this case, you're looking at FDI into Brazil, during Brazil's economic crisis, or even during its recent corruption scandals, we see that China's financing will come in and take advantage of these opportunities to buy cheap assets, right? So oftentimes where comparatively we see Western financing being pretty atomized, right? Where you have portfolio flows, FDI flows, right? Aid flows, and it's all separate. Generally, Chinese financing tends to be more package oriented, where you may have infrastructure financing leading activity, but it's meant to generate trade, foreign direct investment activity, and it's meant through this generation of economic activity to ultimately expand the size of market share of Chinese companies over time. So compared to Western financing, another key feature, right, so far is longer term oriented, more risk tolerant historically, but it also is this lack of policy conditionality. So we tend not to get the same onerous policy conditions, right, that we get through sort of Western multilaterals, or oftentimes are reinforced through market mechanisms. Rather, there tends to be a doctrine of non-intervention in domestic affairs, right, based upon the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence in China. And so ultimately, you get financing that tends not to necessarily focus as much as Western financing on policy conditionality. A good example of this is the policy banks have research arms, and these research arms, ultimately, oftentimes will make recommendations, right? Even recommendations that may involve macroeconomic policies, stabilization policies, things along these lines, but there's no sort of conditionality, right? So oftentimes, even when I've met with researchers at policy banks, they sometimes have even communicated, frustrations at times, right? That they could make and communicate recommendations, but there's not necessarily that teeth to those recommendations. So then this question is, if you have a lack of policy conditionality, well, how do you reinforce or how do you hedge investment risk, right? So in the book, I make an argument that with Chinese financing, you have commercial conditionality instead. So effectively, financing is secured with loans that are collateralized by future commodity deliveries, right? So one key feature that we see in many countries, such as Venezuela and Ecuador, is that effectively you'll have loans to the government, but at the same time, you'll have a separate contract with sales of exports of a commodity from a state-owned enterprise to Chinese importers. With the proceeds of those sales, they will be in bank accounts that are dedicated to repaying Chinese debt, right? So this is one way to hedge risk, even though you don't necessarily have policy conditionality, right? Traditionally, policy conditionality would say, if you have balanced budgets, right, and you build up government savings, and will have more of an ability to repay its debt. Instead, Chinese creditors are trying to secure their financing with commodities, essentially. Also, sometimes with this commercial conditionality, you have guaranteed contracts, or oftentimes with Chinese firms, contractors, and suppliers, right? So part of this is commercial conditionality is hedging risk. Another part of it is creating opportunities for Chinese firms abroad. So if China invests in a hydroelectric plant in Argentina, there are commitments to buy Chinese machinery, Chinese turbines, right? So it's a form of export promotion, very similar to tide aid historically. Now, a key trade-off, as we'll see during this talk as well, will be oftentimes with this commercial conditionality, there's not always contract transparency. So we see generally, oftentimes Latin American publics get very concerned about what's in the fine print, right? Particularly in terms of such things as environmental sustainability, indigenous rights, indigenous opportunities, things along these lines. So in this graph, you can see overall external financing, right? And generally within Latin America, oftentimes governments may not have sufficient financing from or sufficient revenues coming into government to pay down all of their expenditures. So they will look abroad in order to help finance their expenditures. And they can finance this in a variety of different ways. Historically, it's been through global bonds, multilateral loans, et cetera. What you can see happen throughout the 2000s is governments tend to turn to bonds, less so in order to finance their expenditures, as well as multilateral loans as they start to pay down more of their debt. But comparatively, Chinese policy bank loans, particularly since the global financial crisis, accounts for a larger share of that financing internationally. So part of what I want to look at is to the extent to which Chinese policy bank loans are responsible for financing an increasing share of government expenditures, what kind of impact does that have, right? And do we get more policy flexibility, as I suggested we would anticipate, based upon now that global financing being state-led, more long-term, risk-tolerant, and without policy conditionality compared to other flows. Now, what's important, and we'll see throughout this talk too, is there's a trade-off, right? So oftentimes in the newspaper, right, Chinese loans are characterized as primarily state-to-state loans. But we see in Latin America is that they can also be market-oriented, right? They could, in other words, help finance projects, right? And the money would go directly to corporate enterprises to help finance those projects, rather than necessarily directly to the government. So in this graph, you could see that even though state-to-state loans represent a large share of Chinese policy banks financing the region, there are some of these loans that are more market-oriented. So we can take advantage of that variation to see, does it make a difference if the loans, right, are more market-oriented versus state-to-state? Now, why might this be important? Let's turn to Argentina, right? And I'll give an example of these two channels in Argentina. We have the state-to-state channel when China helped finance hydropower stations in Santa Cruz, Argentina. In this case, there was direct contracting with Chinese banks, right, which was allowed for under Argentine law if it was concessional. So there's an advantage of getting this cheaper financing for Argentina. And at the same time, there's still sort of, an increase in state indebtedness here because Argentina provides a state guarantee of the loan. So effectively, you have a state-backed loan, direct contracting. But when we look at the terms of the commercial side of the project, you see that there's a large portion of that project that's oriented towards civil works, right? And almost, more than 75% of that ends up thus giving Argentina some spending discretion, right? Where about a quarter of it is oriented towards paying for Chinese machinery, equipment, and turbines. So you get this advantage of having some fungibility, some discretion, along with cheaper financing, but as mentioned before, issues surrounding transparency. Specifically with this project, the Argentine Supreme Court suspends, right, the advancement of this project because of environmental concerns, right? Effectively, the contract details were not well known. Lots of people fretted about the environmental sustainability of the projects. They end up being renegotiated, and the number of turbines is reduced as well as the generating capacity, right? Now, comparatively, what happens when it goes to the private procurement channel? Here, a good example would be Cauchari's solar park in Argentina. Here, you have a privately managed auction system called Renovar, and it's when Shanghai Electric Power Construction wins the bid, the loan flows directly to corporate enterprises with the winning bid as well, right? So there's not the same state discretion, policy maneuverability. You still get from China's Exim Bank a preferential export buyer's credit, right, that allows for the purchase of Chinese machinery and equipment. So you still have kind of this tied loan element, but you don't get the policy flexibility, right? You don't get that policy discretion that you do when it flows directly towards the government. Also, it tends to be more transparent, right? In this case, there had to be local community consent. There was local members of the community could even receive training to work in the plant, construction and operations. ultimately even got rights to participate in the profits of the project. So there's a lot more transparency compared to when it flows through the state channel. So we're going to be looking at this trade-off effectively of, more degree of maneuverability, right, and a lack of policy conditionality versus commercial conditionality, right? That's a trade-off ultimately that many Latin American countries can face with Chinese financing. So you see here one element of it. These are just descriptive statistics. Effectively, as China's bilateral credit expands as a share of total external financing, we see that on average, primary budget balances also expand as well, right? So this is suggestive of the idea that governments may get more room to maneuver. We also see this, right, in some statistics here as well, and comparative statistics when we look at China's state-to-state financing as a share of debt or GDP, as compared to some more traditional measures, including bonds and multilateral loans. As you can see, with Chinese financing, the sign here, even though it's statistically significant, is negative, meaning fiscal deficits tend to be associated with larger Chinese financing. By comparison, when countries finance themselves with global bonds, multilateral loans, there tends to be a positive relationship here, meaning the more bonds or multilateral loans, the more likely you are to have narrower fiscal deficits or even surpluses, right? So ultimately, whether fiscal deficits are good or bad will reflect the kind of investments that governments make. So it's unclear whether this policy discretion that may come from Chinese loans is sort of a net good or a net bad. However, right, it puts the onus, right, rather than through policy conditionality, which is sort of a check for creditors to ensure that governments are saving enough to repay their debt. Comparatively, China puts the onus on countries to manage that macroeconomic stability, right? And so, depending upon the governance situation locally, right, you could have really good investments or you could have investments that go awry. Here you also see that relationship between this negative association between Chinese financing and negative primary budget balances as well across a range of models. Descriptively, we can also see it in the case of Argentina, Ecuador, and Venezuela here. From 2000 to 2018, if you look at this graph, prior to the global financial crisis, even in these nations that were governed by the left, tended to have budgetary surpluses right up until the global financial crisis. Now, not surprisingly, during an economic downturn, right, we see counter-cyclical, because of these government savings, governments are able to spend counter-cyclically. But the argument I make is that these blue lines would represent Chinese financing, right? And as you can see, as Chinese financing comes in, makes up a larger share of external financing, even though you had a counter-cyclical reaction to the crisis, these budget deficits tend to stay over time. I would make the argument that this would be the result of, right, not necessarily having policy conditionality, right? So governments not necessarily having to have the same kind of checks in terms of budget discipline when they're borrowing from Chinese sources. Now, we see some variation here. For example, Brazil has constitutionally mandated public procurement. What does that mean? Right? That means that effectively Brazil can't finance itself through direct contracts, right, with China. So effectively, it flows directly to corporate enterprises in Brazil. So as a result, much of Brazil's financing is still very market oriented. And you can see as a result, even during a time where there's economic downturns and you get sort of initially some countercyclical reaction, you also get the implementation of a constitutional spending cap, right? In order to ensure, right, in a country that has expanding government liabilities over time, this constitutional spending cap is implemented in order to ensure budgetary balance in the long run, right? I would make the argument that the market forces and Brazil's share of market financing helps kind of keep this budgetary constraint relative to a country like Venezuela, where there was no constraint that came with Chinese financing. Okay, so now I want to switch over to commercial conditionality, right? So to date, we've made an argument essentially that as Chinese financing flows to national governments through direct contracting, state-to-state lending, the public balance sheet is often expanding, right? We've seen sort of this relationship, a correlation. Now, on the flip side, as mentioned, right, even though there's no policy conditionality, we get commercial conditionality. And there's two types of commercial conditionality that tend to flow with Chinese financing. One is, right, it's oriented towards promoting Chinese commerce. So not hedging risk as much as promoting Chinese commerce. So that's bilateral tide aid, that's seeking to expand Chinese foreign content. Good example of this would be something like, the preferential buyer's credit from the Export-Import Bank of China. In the case of Argentina, right, Argentina is one of the countries in Latin America with the most nuclear power reactors, right? It has 3 of Latin America's 7 nuclear power reactors. So effectively, China looks at its global share of nuclear energy. It's around 9-10%, compared to a country like Russia, where it's at about 45% of the global market. It can use this concessional preferential buyer's credit in order to, right, aid in the construction of a new nuclear power plant in Argentina. But then there's stipulations that the nuclear reactor will be built by China, the foreign content and the purchases of machinery will all be related to China. So that can expand China's commercial presence in nuclear energy, not only in Argentina, but also globally, right? So there's this element of expanding, right? Rather than focus on individual profitability, it's focused on market maximization and expanding the share of Chinese business strategically and internationally. You often tend to have commercial interest rates, right? So sometimes we get, an orientation where it's called development finance, but oftentimes there can be commercial interest rates. And Chinese policy banks have the flexibility based upon the situation. Sometimes we get lower interest rates than the market. Other times we get rates that are closer to the market, right? So this isn't necessarily straight for development finance, right? There also tends to be an element of this that's also oriented towards currency promotion, renminbi promotion. So to date, right, much of global commerce, global trade within Latin America tends to be oriented towards commodities. So a lot of this is settled in dollars today. But we see China building the apparatus, right, through commercial banks, through its policy banks, through central bank swaps, to eventually in the long run be able to use a renminbi, right? And so there is an element of this that also is oriented towards internationalization of the renminbi. So we have this kind of set of commercial conditionality that's oriented towards promoting Chinese commerce. But then we also get tools for managing sovereign risk, right? When meeting with policy bank officials in China, right, they would highlight essentially that, well, we have a different way of managing risk from the West, right? And we're very good at it, right? And so essentially, right, they would highlight a multitude of different things, one being administrative channels, right? In the case of the hydroelectric plants I mentioned before in Argentina, when there was that environmental stay put forward, China directly communicated, right, with Argentina, sending letters and reminding Argentina about cross-default clauses that were contained within the contracts. And if Argentina didn't move forward with those hydroelectric plants, China would pull its financing elsewhere, right? So there's this use of administrative channels in the contract to kind of enforce agreements, right? And even though you saw there was a negotiation and turbines were reduced and generating capacity was reduced, nonetheless, the project kept moving forward. You also get commodity guarantees, as mentioned earlier, commodity-backed loans. This was very popular in places like Ecuador and Venezuela, where governments got more discretion through direct lending, but then the state-owned enterprise would sell exports to Chinese importers, take the proceeds, put it in a bank account that's dedicated to repaying that debt. And finally, you have state-backed commercial insurance that would help support and mitigate this risk through state companies such as Sinosure. So when looking at cross-default clauses, this is an example of the kind of cross-default clause that you would see in contracts. This is from Argentina's contracts, and this highlights the cross-default clause that existed between the Belgrano cargo railway and the hydroelectric plants I mentioned earlier. Interestingly enough, the hydroelectric plants had very relatively low Chinese content, only 30%, compared to a traditional deal. So at the time, China was actually inserting this cross-default clause in order to ensure that the cargo railway was built, because they had the 100% of the content in that contract relatively. So ironically, even though they use a cross default clause to ensure that the hydroelectric plants move forward, it was contained because they were very concerned about the cargo railway moving forward. So here we can see, again, a set of descriptive statistics where the first kind of commercial conditionality that's oriented towards expanding Chinese commerce is one here. That's kind of firms, contracts to buy from Chinese firms, machinery, things on these lines, right? And we can see the black is if it goes through corporate financing. The gray is if it goes through China's state-to-state financing. The two highlights these commodity-backed loans, right? Securing lending with natural resource, commodities, things along these lines. The gray, again, is your state-to-state relative to China's corporate financing. What we see here is with the state-to-state financing, you tend to get a lot more of these kind of oil for loan deals, commodity guaranteed, resource guarantees in order to help secure the loan. So even though you get this policy conditionality or lack of policy conditionality, potentially more degrees of maneuverability for a government, at the same time, there are these commercial conditions that are guaranteed instead through natural resources and commodities. And you can see this relationship here. In general, there's association as China's state-to-state financing makes up a greater percentage of total Chinese financing. You tend to have more commercial conditionality over time. So in the remaining time here, what I want to do is then, from the Latin American perspective, talk about these benefits and costs in a little more detail that come from Chinese financing. And then also look at what China's doing in light of, right, some of the risk it's taken on in the region, right? So some people argue that China has engaged in debt trap diplomacy in the region. In other words, they purposely indebted other countries in order to get cheap assets from those countries. Essentially, what my work, right, and other people's work, I know Meg, has illustrated similar points in her own work as well, effectively showing that, well, this is much more of a creditor trap in some ways, right? Where China, as a new rising creditor, has made bets within Latin America that have gone awry. And so the lack of policy conditionality in some ways has left China much more exposed to credit risk. And it tried to mitigate this credit risk through resources and commodities, but was ultimately left exposed. So let's look at those trends in a little more detail. First, we have the benefits, right? So I highlighted that, long-term financing in a region, right, that has struggled, in the 90s and the 2000s with austerity and implementing austerity in order to attract capital. What got cut over time? Well, actually, education, healthcare, these things actually expanded in the region, even during periods of austerity, oftentimes in the long run, but where governments had to make the cuts with infrastructure. So we see sort of large infrastructure deficits throughout the region, right? In the 2000s, we had Latin American investment at a mere about 0.6% of GDP compared to 3% rates in 1980s. So when China comes in with this long-term infrastructure financing, it's incredibly appealing to Latin American governments that need infrastructure, right? And they're not getting it sufficient amounts through private sector, et cetera, right? Take Ecuador as a great example. They had a hydroelectric power plant project in the works for over a course of a decade or so, but couldn't arrange financing from Argentina and other suitors. But in comes China with multi-billion-dollar financing willing to do that, right? So Ecuador looks at that, and that's a great opportunity from Ecuador's perspective. But, right, this financing can come with costs, right? And this is where the commercial conditionality is really important because loans are tied, as mentioned earlier, to Chinese firms, products, and machinery. So just like trade negotiations, right? Again, sometimes this infrastructure financing has a development, right, rhetoric that's associated with it, but it's very much commercially oriented. And so when it comes down to the commercial side of these contracts, it's oftentimes a negotiation about the local content, right? A good example of this is in Argentina during the Kirchner administration, when they're very dependent upon Chinese financing coming in. They were not able to, they would negotiated for manual labor, right? For the public works projects, did that very well. Weren't able to necessarily negotiate for certain parts of the project, certain types of local content. For example, Argentina has an industry in railway ties, right? but they weren't able to secure, right, the components or those railway ties for the cargo railway during the Kirchner administration when these loans were first negotiated. The Macri administration comes in, opens up to global markets, has more of a diversified financing source, is better able to negotiate for this local content, right? So one is that even though this is infrastructure financing that sometimes sort of has this development rhetoric, has this win-win rhetoric, at the end of the day, Latin American countries need to have a buyer beware attitude because it ultimately reflects a trade negotiation over local content. There's also lots of concerns about middle income trap, right? This is a concern that China has, right, in its own economic development. But we also see throughout Latin America, right? The history of Latin America has been one where countries have been very commodity dependent and wanted to diversify into industry over a very long period of time. And to some extent, right, if you think of the way these contracts are completed within Latin America, oftentimes, as mentioned before, they're secured with commodities, right? Oil deliveries, commodity deliveries. But what's happening in exchange for that, all these countries are buying, right, Chinese capital inputs, Chinese machinery. So there are concerns of hollowing out of Latin America's industrial sector. Now, of course, China's aware of this, so they also say, listen, we understand you want more value added. We're willing to kind of do more manufacturing investment, things along these lines. But if you look at to date, much of that has gone to Brazil, right? So only 1/10 of Chinese FDI has been destined for Latin American manufacturing sector. 2/3 of that investment has gone to Brazil. There's also the question of just labor costs, right? Latin America is a region that tends to have higher labor costs. That can be very difficult to then compete with Southeast Asia or other countries in Africa when it comes to these kind of advantages for labor-intensive manufacturing. And then finally, there's indebtedness, right? We'll get to indebtedness in a moment. But first, we can just look at, again, these charts showing descriptive statistics over time. And you can see as China joins the WTO, this black line is high-tech manufacturing inputs from China, right? Expands dramatically. The dotted line, since China joins the WTO, which is high-tech manufacturing imports from the US, relatively steady over time. But obviously one of the big concerns is here, we have countries like Argentina, we have, unicorns, tech companies that are emerging, but right, to what extent can that be a broader trend within the region, right? And so some of these patterns are are reflective of Latin America's concerns about middle income track and the ability to be able to diversify into higher technology goods. Then we also see sort of in terms of commodity dependency, again, stylized facts, just descriptive statistics here. You see that effectively Latin America's primary commodity exports to China continue to kind of be high over time. And Latin America's manufacturing good exports to China have even dropped off over time, one from off of a relatively low base, but one from when China joins the WTO, but then also after the global financial crisis. So you see in stylized facts that there tends to be, a lack of Latin American opportunities for Chinese market in terms of their own manufacturing goods. So the final cost would be in terms of indebtedness, right? And in terms of indebtedness, there's concern about the moral hazard problem, right? If you do not have policy conditionality, it could give governments more degrees of maneuverability. Coming out of an era, right, of austerity, this can be a very positive thing if governments spend wisely. However, when you do not have that policy conditionality, and if governments are not willing to orient themselves to good macroeconomic policies, macroeconomic stabilization, then you could have sort of expansive government balance sheets without sort of any kind of check, right? And this is the kind of thing that we see happening in Venezuela, as well as Ecuador too, during these periods of time, where effectively they use government commodities, as mentioned before, to help enable this state-to-state lending. Both countries expand their state balance sheets, but then owe China a lot of oil resources over time that are oriented towards help financing. In the case of Ecuador, it's 4 years of oil exports, right, that were used to finance present consumption. And so this tends to be an issue in terms of indebtedness for the region. And this also reinforces the point I made earlier about China's creditor trap, right? As Venezuela enters into a debt moratorium in 2016, right, effectively, China cannot get its interest payments, its oil payments, the proceeds from those oil sales, right, are not sufficient. So China is in a defensive lending posture, trying to reschedule and restructure loans in order to get new principal and interest payments. It's quite similar to the kind of stance commercial banks in Latin America faced during the Latin American debt crisis. So from this standpoint, I would make the argument that China's a new creditor globally, and rather than a debt trap, made bets in countries like Venezuela and was not able to effectively, how did they make the bet? They said, okay, Venezuela's oil production will be sufficient that will sort of underwrite this lending, right? That will finance or support this lending, collateralize this lending ultimately. What happens, so we'll see in a moment, Venezuela's oil production, right, falls dramatically, right? So there's not the proceeds to repay these loans. And effectively, that's where it's sort of a mispricing creditor risk situation rather than, from my standpoint, an intentional desire to make Venezuela indebted over time. So we'll close with these few graphs and before looking at how China as a creditor are reacting to these trends. And you can see in the case of Venezuela, this is Venezuela's foreign debt over time. You can see it's greatly expanding. And by 2019, it's over 200% of GDP. In the red here is the amount that China accounts for, right? So oftentimes this rhetoric of debtor trap is used in countries like Venezuela, but you can even see it's only about 20% of the overall debt that China is accountable for, right? So if we're going to use a debtor trap language, we have to think of Wall Street bankers, right? To think of everybody that has exposure to Venezuela during the period and was willing to kind of continue to lend. So the problem ultimately is that Chinese policy banks thought, all right, we'll collateralize this lending with oil, but what happens? Oil production falls over time, right? This is thousands of barrels per day. And you could see from 2006 to 2007, all the way to 2019, right? You see essentially that oil production, basically falls by about a third or so during that period of time. In the red is what China is promised, right? In terms of oil sales. And you could see that it ends up being a larger and larger share of what's outstanding. What does this mean? State oil companies, right, have pre-commitments then to Russia, to China, to the Caribbean, right, through, PetroCaribe, right, sort of foreign aid program. There's less and less available to reinvest in the companies, right? So you have a situation where essentially as Venezuela goes through an economic and humanitarian crisis, oil production is faltering, there's not enough proceeds to repay its debt. And we have a situation where Venezuela goes into the debt moratorium, hence a creditor trap. Okay, so in closing, we have about a minute remaining here. China now is taking more of a diversified strategy in the region, right? Because it had this state-to-state lending, and still a lot of its outstanding debt ends up being state-to-state, but they're also thinking about, okay, how do we diversify our exposure in light of the commodity downturn and more recently the COVID pandemic? So we see China increasingly using equity rather than debt financing to diversify its exposure from the state-to-state level. So in other words, we see state-backed equity funds, right? In other words, capital reserves or money from policy banks that are used in order to directly invest in companies in manufacturing, logistics, agriculture across many countries, including Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Jamaica. We see there's $40 billion of funds dedicated to Latin America since the global commodity downturn and $40 billion dedicated to Silk Road Fund. But only for this Latin American funds, $2 billion were actually implemented or dispersed within Latin America right prior to COVID. That only represented about 5% of Chinese capital that was committed to these funds. So we see that they're trying to diversify, but it's incrementally, right? So much of it still remains state to state. What else do we see? We see increasing move towards multilateralism, right? We even see it over President Xi's speeches at the BRI Forum from 2017 to 2019. We get an increasing focus on multilateralism, right? New investment partners. Chinese commercial banks are becoming more active internationally as well. And we see more partnerships with multilateral institutions, including the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank. I would argue this is in part, this move towards multilateralism is reflective of a desire to try to mitigate some of this debt burden over time as well by trying to diversify its finance flows moving forward. We can also see the AIIB is operating with private procurement through international bidding. So China is also increasingly sort of talking about the importance of private procurement and international bidding. So given what we've learned from Latin America, where when financing flows through those channels, it tends to be more transparent. And governments tend not to have that same discretion. The money goes right into corporate enterprises and projects, right? This may be also, even though we think traditionally of China as state-to-state lending, if we see more and more taking place through the private sector or through procurement programs, that could be potentially a positive sign in terms of trends such as transparency. So with that, just want to close with a saying from John Maynard Keynes. Essentially, the old saying holds: owe your banker 1,000 pounds and you're at his mercy. Owe him 1 million pounds and the position is reversed. Hence, one of lessons for China and Latin America has been one where, even though they thought they securitized their lending through oil for loan contracts, commodities, natural resources, right, they have found themselves in a position of defensive lending, right? In places like Ecuador and Venezuela, having to restructure in order to get access to payment arrears. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. I just learned a ton. I have a lot of reactions myself, but that's not my job right now. My job is to introduce our discussant, Professor Laura Alfaro. Laura is the Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. She holds a number of professional positions at the MBER and other places, including the Dr. Class Policy Committee. She is an economist whose work relates to the field of international economics, and in particular, international capital flows, foreign direct investment, sovereign debt, trade, and emerging markets, so all relevant topics. And between 2010 and 2012, she served as the Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica on a leave from HBS. So most of us just take sabbatical, but she ran an economy and knows many of the people featured in your book, many of the policymakers with whom Chinese investors or lenders are engaged in Latin America. And so, Laura will now discuss the book for a few minutes, and then we'll give Professor Kaplan a chance to respond. And again, I invite the audience members to please leave their questions in the Q&A box, and I'll be asking them after this exchange. So thank you, Laura, for doing this.
Thanks. Let me share. Do you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Meg. She reached out to me last week to comment this book. And I have to say that I did spend a lot of time reading it. I do recommend you to buy the book. So I'm trying to give you back some of the royalties that Meg took away. If not, your local library is always accessible. So this is a fascinating book. And as was mentioned, I'm not going to overview it. It does have two big parts. The big part tells you the story of China as a rising global creditor. The second part looks at the world through the eyes of, looks at this relation through the eyes of Latin America. So it's a rich analysis, again, of this capital flows relation. I would say long, because I'm an economist, we tend to do little articles. So I did spend some time yesterday burning the midnight oil. But again, I just couldn't stop reading the book. As was mentioned by Meg, full disclosure, my political party was the one that actually negotiated the transition from Taiwan to China. This was a realpolitik movement for a country like Costa Rica that we do, our main source of income are related to trade, capital flows, tourism. We just could not have relations with China. And so the overall thesis that one should engage with different players, in particular capital flows players, I would agree. And again, this is what we did. But as my boss would say, and when I say boss, I mean the vice president of the country. When I was an undergrad in Costa Rica, I worked in a small consulting firm. It just so happens that who became later the vice president when I was there was my former boss. So it was an interesting relation because he still saw me as a student and I was happy still to learn from him. He used to own the biggest bank in Costa Rica. And so, as he would say, one needs to engage all the possible relations, but one does need to read the contracts. And so what I'm going to do is focus on three topics. I'm actually going to reorganize some of the arguments as costs. the cost of a project is not only the interest rate. Another argument is I actually do see the lack of transparency as a big problem, apart from something that Carmen Reinhardt and Christopher Travers have documented. There is a lot of hidden debts. So a lot of the graphs we need to take with care because they are under, perhaps, representing some of the burden with China. I do think that budget constraints matter. Even if you don't want to write the budget constraint, if you want to ignore it, it's still there. And I do think sustainability came back to haunt, as was mentioned. And the last one is, I think projects should be judged by the social rate of return. An infrastructure project on its own is not necessarily a great project. And so that I do think it would be nice to engage in the next paper if you want, or book. So let me go back to first the topic of the cost. It is not clear to me, per se, these loans are cheap, even in an interest rate point of view, because we're talking about the era of the very low interest rates. Here I plotted the US Fed funds rate after the global financial crisis. Is the time everyone went to low interest rates, just to be surprised by the current era, where the even lower interest rates. We have defined the levers over the zero lower bound. The Europeans effectively have a nominal negative rate, but everyone could borrow at low rates. When I was in government, we knew our problem was not lack of financing. Our problem was capability of implementing good projects. Every country in Latin America was able to spend in bad times. We don't have that part, a problem with that part. When we're Keynesian, we do spend in bad times. Our problems, we cannot save in good times. And that is what is required to be Keynesian. Related to that, this is also the time when Latin America actually managed to borrow in local currency. There is this famous concern coined by Aiken Green-Hausenman and then my good friend Hugo Paninza, that Latin America cannot borrow in local currency, and that is a symptom of many things. There has been redemption to this scene, and Latin America is able to borrow in local currency, except from China. And it is true that there are swap lines, but they're still paid in dollars. It's unclear to me those swap lines are going to ever be used, especially in this volatile time. Related to that, we actually have managed to extend our maturity. The average maturity in 2015 for Latin America is 20 years. And this does include very short-term financing needed for government. Peru, Mexico, and Brazil managed to sell 100-year bonds. So private capital is more patient than I would say the book makes it sound to be, many forms of finance. And even Latin America has managed to extend maturity even to 100-year bonds. I would say that the fact that you have to buy the factors from China, machinery, equipment, labor, actually means that the project is more expensive, goes back to the cost. You do mention cases where they didn't have to bring the Chinese labor. Costa Rica did bring the Chinese labor to some of those projects. And overall, apart from the cost, if you do not have your workers, that means that you lose the spillovers, the learning, the know-how. So this is worse in many levels, but it also increases the cost related to sometimes you're stuck with worse quality inputs. There are many explicit and implicit guarantees. When you read a lot of these contracts, there are rate of returns, demand, and as I said, exchange rate. Latin America is bearing the exchange rate risk. Many of the contracts that look like FDI equity that are not. You go and read them, they're full of contingencies. They become non-contingent contracts. Even the private contracts have implicit government guarantees. I can guarantee you that if a big hydro goes belly up, the government has to intervene, but many do have explicit in terms of a lot of these clauses. Collateral, I actually see it the other way. Being able to borrow more against collateral has never been a puzzle. The puzzle in sovereign debt is that you manage to borrow without collateral and without an international institution to deal with bankruptcies. So if they pledge collateral, they borrow more, that's fine. Of course, as we have found out, they have more and more to refinancing because a lot of this collateral is very hard to repossess, and a lot of this restructuring is not very transparent. And again, there are all these problems with non-disclosure clauses. The renegotiation is a mess. You have to go to China for arbitration. Good luck with that one. And as you know, your colleague Anna Gelper and co-authors have written a lot about these contracts. The second, as I said, I do think lack of transparency is a big issue. First, it is hand in hand with corruption, and this has been terrible for our region, delegitimizes spending and taxation. I have a little paper that I'm presenting at the AAR Papers and Proceedings where we compared 3 scenarios: the world without China, the world with China with incomplete information, but the world with China and complete information. We do many robustness where we look at whether these type of lending are substitutes or complements, different cases of default cost and renegotiation, what happens if they can collateralize lending or not. And we do get that when China appears, it does reduce the sustainability and leads to more defaults, something that Carmen Beijana and co-authors have documented, these complex renegotiations. But the best world is always one where you have transparency, but that doesn't mean that China loses market share. And I do think that what we're seeing is that they just played that there was no sustainability. There is. We now see a lot of these problems. And what is interesting is that sovereign default has always been a problem of willingness to pay more than capacity to pay. But when a country gets to 200% of GDP, and this is not only Venezuela, but a lot of the little islands and countries in Africa, I would actually say that they have a capacity to pay. And this has never been the issue in sovereign debt. China has put these countries in capacity to pay problems. And then again, a project is a project when you see it. You have to go and read the contract, all the clauses. And here, I'm not that convinced. Many of these projects have social rate of returns. I actually took an undergrad project evaluation course. Social rates of returns will give you all the externalities, all the linkages. And again, one does need to do the calculations. The lack of environmental assessment is a problem. It's not trivial, even if it's by design. Many of these projects are actually not finished. So we have a road with China. It's at 40% of where it should be. It's a mess to renegotiate. Like every time we're trying to do something, it just becomes a complete mess. And so the big question is, have these projects benefit the people? And it's interesting that the 2 cases they use a lot in the case are the sad, famous examples in Latin America of GDP reversals. Argentina was the richest country. It's not anymore, and every year is less. Venezuela, which by the way is not a democracy, is also the same story. Argentina, 9 defaults and counting, inflation above 50% before crisis. Inflation is one of the most regressive taxes. That means sustainability and budget constraints matter. They were not going around them. They are paying for these projects, taxing the poorest of their people. Venezuela, hyperinflations, again, before the pandemic. And you talked about that trilemma. Both Argentina and Venezuela also have capital controls. I would argue that flexible exchange rates have been very helpful and useful for Latin America. But in the case of Venezuela, there was another part of the, if you want, another leg that was not thought in the Mundell trilemma, people leaving, and that's what happened. Venezuela has one of the worst refugee crises in the region. That's what's solving this equation. And again, many of the projects with China are unfinished. And of course, the big question is whether conditionality would have made it better. It's unclear, but clearly what they got didn't make it better. Ecuador, again, where is it? At the IMF. It's interesting that Correa, after he left government, he went to the cheap country of Belgium, and that's where he was staying. And now there is this, just recently, about the corruption probes. Multilaterals are political. That is a reality. There is a reason why Argentina has 9 defaults, because they managed to come back. If they were not political, Argentina wouldn't have so many defaults. But they do ask you to open the books. And that is a good thing. There is no drawback of making a country open the books and find out what is it that they're doing. So to conclude, as I said, I do agree competition of world bankers are beneficial, but I am not as convinced that this lack of transparency has helped us develop. Lack of transparency does not necessarily mean there are no conditions. It just means that we don't know about them. And let me finish with the great words of one of the most smart people I ever met, my grandma. She would always tell me, if you cannot tell me what you're doing, it's because you're not doing something good. So let me end there.
Thank you, Professor Alfaro, for your comments. I'm going to give Professor Kaplan a minute to respond, or a couple minutes. I did a figurative minute, and then I know I have a question, but I'm gonna go to the Q&A first. And so we have quite a while left, so Professor Kaplan.
Terrific. Thank you, Professor Alfaro. I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking so much time with the book. And your reflections are super helpful, including social rate of returns in terms of future projects. I think that's a really good idea, trying to think about social rate of return. In terms of some of the different points here, I'll try to highlight them as quickly as possible. One, transparency, right? It's part of the trade-off here, right? And I absolutely agree with you. I mean, one of the things, a nice part about doing the field research here and meeting with people in person is you get a lot of people reflecting in government on the potential implicit costs here, right, in terms of the lack of transparency, right? A lot of people talking about sort of lack of fine print, things along these lines. There's even sometimes like interagency differences I've noticed, right? When you meet with people, where oftentimes the finance ministry, depending on the country, is front and center and negotiating these things. But then oftentimes planning ministries and other ministries have very different ideas in terms of what should be the key negotiation points as well, right? So I think that's also really important. One key place that came out is a place like Ecuador, where the planning, people from planning ministries were saying, wow, we should focus so much more on local content and opportunities and all these things within the negotiation, and we didn't, right? So I think transparency is definitely an extremely key issue. And as well as the sustainability of the projects, right? We're seeing in places like Ecuador, fissures in some of the walls that were built, right? The dams and things along these lines. So there's important trade-offs, not only in terms of transparency, but also in terms of sustainability as well, right? And that's part of the broader trade-offs here. Also, your point about inflation, terrific. It actually connects to my previous book, was all about austerity politics and sort of the regressive tax that inflation is. So undoubtedly, right, if you have expansive fiscal policies that lead to inflation, countries are going to pay with that higher cost over the long run as well. So yeah, I think it's sort of not only the social rate of return on infrastructure projects, but expanding the horizon to also consider what happens down the road in terms of inflation as well. Also really good ideas, really good thoughts here. In terms of some of the other factors mentioned, and I'll try to be really quick here as well. Original sin, right? Undoubtedly really important. My previous work that looked at bond financing, this is really important. And the fact that many countries were able to issue locally, that helped diversify away from some of this risk. But importantly, China does not do this, right? So you're still effectively borrowing in dollars. You still have that exchange rate risk. And I think it was exemplified by a minister I met with in Brazil who said, we did this before. We don't need this from China, right? We did this direct lending. We took on this exchange rate risk. We took on this debt. We don't need to do it again, right? So I think that's also a very good point as well. And then finally, in terms of one last point in terms of negotiations here that you mentioned in terms of the labor content, right? This is something we see a lot of variation within the region, where countries that had more capacity, like a Brazil, to kind of push negotiations, we actually saw that investment was stalled from China. It didn't come right away because Brazil really wasn't willing to grant visas for Chinese workers, right? That kind of slowed the process. Now today, when the Chinese president comes to Brazil, he talks about Brazilian jobs, right? And so that's a big difference compared to other countries where you see that Chinese labor was permitted to enter, without the same constraints. So I think that's another really important thing to consider. And in terms of these kind of human flows, obviously, I think your point with the trilemma is really good to then think about, okay, what do we do in terms of human outflows, right? When you think of the fall of oil production in a place like Venezuela, one key component is a loss of managerial expertise. And that was a product of the outflow of human capital. So also sort of a very important trend. But thank you very much. These insights were terrific. I think they've generated some nice ideas for future projects. So I appreciate it.
Great. So I will thank the audience for their attention and patience and open it up. So the first question that I'll give you is from Professor William Shao from the School of Public Health, an economist. And he asked if loans financed by U.S. policy banks like the Export-Import Bank have similar bilateral tied trade or purchase U.S. equipment requirements as the Chinese. And I'll give you just two at a time for the sake of efficiency, I guess. And Andrew Quayle asked, to what extent is China using its leverage as a major existing and future lender to support anti-democratic or corrupt regimes? And so, for example, Maduro and Venezuela and increasingly other groups in other countries to obtain support in the UN for votes in favor of China and against the US. So kind of comparative economic question and then the political question. Which I have a variation on too. So I'll have my question in a little bit, but I'll let you respond to those things.
Yes, I've been answering questions over Zoom now for a full year and a half, and I still don't hit the mute button right when it's time. I start talking without the mute. Okay, so in terms of the first set of questions, tied aid, this is not in any way unique to China, right? So I divided, their commercial conditionality. I would say the oil for loan deals are a more unique thing that their policy banks have implemented compared to tied aid, which is much more common. We've seen that in the US. We've seen many powers use that tied aid, right, where they attach, commercial conditions or conditions to their aid, right, that you have to contract with US firms, for example. So, one thing to note is that indeed, the oil for loans, there is some precedent for that, even though China has implemented this on the world stage. The precedent comes from Japan, right? When Japan's economic activity globally and in regions like Latin America, they sort of were some of the first to implement these oil for loan deals. So, China's really increased the scale of that. But even there, right, they're borrowing a bit from the historic playbook with Japan. Then in terms of the question about transparency, anti-democratic forces, things along these lines. I think that, first in terms of the transparency question, from what I can gather in my interviews, and I'm not, when I did this research, it was not oriented towards transparency primarily. It's something that would come out on a secondary basis through interviews, through secondary sources, things along these lines. There's nothing overt, right? Like I would say, like, Russia's experience in Venezuela, there's a pretty overt geopolitical game. I think China has a less overt kind of game that it plays. That being said, I want to share with you a quote from a foreign investment guide that sort of Chinese embassies put out. In this case, it's actually for Costa Rica. It says, it's a democratic nature often creates gridlock and massive amount of inefficiencies. So you can see, and this is not just Costa Rica, through many of these foreign investment guides, they're telling their firms when things are too open, too democratic, and too transparent to be aware. So that's direct communication with their firms. But you do see this kind of, and probably the best way to put it is concern about efficiency, right? And you see it both ways, because certainly in places like Ecuador, when you had a 5-year plan and there was a rush to implement a lot of this infrastructure, efficiency was important. But as Laura was highlighting, there's a trade-off there, right? And sometimes with efficiency also comes lack of transparency, right? So we see it in that way. Also, I want to highlight the difference between Central America and South America, right? So a lot of my research, particularly primary research, is oriented towards South America. But as you heard from Laura's comments earlier on, Professor Alfaro's comments earlier on, is that, effectively China had a type of checkbook diplomacy in the region. In order to get the spigots of Chinese investment and financing, you had to sort of, commit to a one China policy. And we see that happening, Costa Rica, Panama, lots of places within Central America and the Caribbean. But this political conditionality tended to be a lot more common in Central America than necessarily South America.
Great. So let me insert myself and ask my questions. So the first question I have is sort of thinking about the creditor trap and about China's willingness to renegotiate, right? And so, I mean, I take Laura's point, and I say this all the time, sovereign debt is really never about capacity. It's always about willingness. And so it's always political, right? So it's hard to separate the political and economic. And so taking that as true, it seems interesting to me, and especially, when we think about what China wants, right? And so the argument that I get from your book is basically what China wants is increased market share and market access to the countries in which it's either investing or to whom it's lending, right? And so, but then, they run into trouble, right? And they run into trouble economically when countries encounter, for example, commodity price drops, pandemics, those kinds of things. And then they run into trouble politically because their investments get politicized. And then you have things like a Supreme Court intervention in Argentina or presidential elections that run on anti-China platforms. And then a lot of the green hostage stuff, I'm not denying that many of the problems have actual engineering problems and environmental problems, significant ones that are surprising everyone. But in any case, you get, we're suspending the project based on environmental concerns, and then there's a renegotiation. So I want to know from your view, if you think the Chinese entities that you've studied, are they more sensitive to the economics or the politics? So basically, does China want friends or doesn't want money, right? So you can see, a trade-off there to a certain extent, right? Because if they want a return on the investment, or if they want the export credits, and I should just mention, in response to Professor Xiao's question, most of the Marshall Plan was actually export credits. So it's not, in that sense, it's like, how do we explain the rise of American industries in the 1950s and 60s? Well, they were exporting to Europe because Europe could only basically import from America. So that's there is precedent there too. But in any case, is it politics or is it bottom lines? Would China be excited to have a country that basically hates it, but is nonetheless open to Chinese firms and able to pay them back? And how do you see that trade-off playing out? And then a second kind of related question is about domestic politics, right? So some of the countries you're looking at are democracies, others are, nominally kind of socialist or communist type dictatorships, however you want to categorize Venezuela these days. And so do you find a difference in domestic politics and how it affects basically interactions with China? I mean, my hypothesis would be that democracies extract better deals from China when they renegotiate, for basic reasons we might expect in terms of two-tabled games, et cetera. And is that basically what you find in Latin America, or is that variation not something you really explore? Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much for these questions. Terrific. So does China want friends, or does it want monetary power? I don't know if it's quite that dichotomy, but I will try to prioritize or weight those. I think, for the most part, and particularly initially, I think a big part of the drive within Latin America does reflect the internationalization of Chinese firms, right? And Chinese geoeconomics. And so because of that, I think the countries that have a large share of commodities, right, large share of important markets, right? This is not necessarily development. This is much more commercial. So I think it's willing to sort of engage in an economic first kind of diplomacy, right? Or a geoeconomic diplomacy, much more when there are markets or commodities at stake, right? I think even as we sort of talked about before, I think in the case of many Central American countries, right, it ends up being more about politics, particularly with something like the political conditionality about the one China policy. I think there's variation even in Central America, but I do think you see those differences. I also think in terms of undoubtedly, right, they're very aware of the optics, right? So with Venezuela, not only is Venezuela an issue in Chinese domestic, politics to some extent, right, as sort of, wow, what happened with those investments, but even internationally, right? Because you had essentially China investing in a country that's a dictatorship, right? And the debt's going awry. There was a lot of criticism throughout the region from other democracies, right? So effectively, China was really aware of those kind of criticism. I would even argue in the case of Ecuador, it was willing to renegotiate because that's generally what they've done when they've run into trouble. But there's also, I think, an element of optics with Ecuador, right? After what happened to Venezuela, right? I think there was sort of a desire to, renegotiate in part for political reasons, right? Because of the kind of flack and soft power politics that China was worried about within the region. Then you also have sort of the broader question in terms of this renegotiation and how important is regime type for negotiation. I think what's clear from both the field research on the Chinese side, talking to bankers, and this is implicitly, not explicitly, right? And then talking with people within Latin America, is that China prefers to deal state to state, right? If it had its preference, undoubtedly, they prefer the efficiency, they prefer the state to state kind of negotiation. That being said, they're very flexible, right? And they'll also sort of use these market mechanisms I talked about based upon the country they're confronting, right? So in Brazil, they're much more likely to invest FDI directly in corporations, et cetera, right? So you see a diversified portfolio. Then comes a question of renegotiation. I think, and I haven't tested this, right? But I would agree with your prior, where I think to some extent, in Venezuela, the fact that you just have sort of this outstanding debt moratorium, and you even sort of have a willingness of, Venezuelan authorities to prioritize Russia over China, right? And then this debt is sort of an overhang as you have really poor economic governance. I'd be surprised in a democracy if you could facilitate that kind of economic behavior for that long of a time, right? But again, that's just a prior. Comparatively, I think in democracies, and some of this comes back to the point about labor I was making earlier, when you have stronger institutions that are willing to push for issues that people care about, such as labor, right? In Argentina, when I met with folks there, one key thing that they highlighted was within the negotiations with China, right? The labor minister said, listen, we have to use Argentine labor, right? There's no choice. We have to use Argentine labor on the manual labor with these deals, right? It has to happen. Otherwise, I'm going to get killed by the unions. And so that's a kind of trend that you would see in democracies, but you might not necessarily see in autocracy. So I think in terms of that negotiation, particularly in terms of labor, local content, some of these issues that evolve, local labor and firms, I would agree with that prior, that democracies may be able to extract more out of these negotiations, right?
Great. So we have a couple more questions and not too much time. So if you have a last minute question, you should throw it in here. But a couple of interesting questions about basically comparing with the US, right? So, I mean, what's interesting, or, why I tend to know more about China's engagement in Central Asia and Southeast Asia, but nothing, right, about its engagement in the Americas. But here you have China engaging in the place where it's typically been American companies and American international financial institutions and financial institutions that have been doing this. So, to what extent is the US trying to counter what China's doing in Latin America? Is there any sense of US competition, either from the corporate side, or this idea that Laura concluded with and you conclude with the competition of world bankers, right? So has the competition been enhanced? Do we see increased fervor from the US or the West in general? And how do you see that playing out in the region?
Sure. So I think there's been two trends along those lines. One, right, I mentioned that since the commodity downturn, China has established these state-backed equity funds. In other words, using China's reserves in order to allocate specifically towards investment in corporate enterprises, right, in Latin America, Africa, throughout the world. Now, what we've seen comparatively in order to kind of meet the competition challenge from China is we've seen things historically, entities like OPIC or Export-Import Bank in the United States, right? Remember, there was a political debate that was oriented towards closing the Export-Import Bank. Now what we've seen, since sort of China has emerged more aggressively on the world stage as a competitor, we've actually seen a willingness to capitalize those institutions and through the BUILD Act, actually support private equity, US private equity abroad. Now, the scale is nowhere near what China's committed, but there's a realization politically that this might be a necessary thing to compete better on the world stage. And so certainly now you have an Institution Development Finance Corporation that is marshaling resources in this way. I also think industrial policy, right? Things have changed on the global stage to some extent in terms of industrial policy. We know East Asia in general has always used sort of industrial policy, national guidance, national champions, things along these lines. But I think with China sort of using the subsidized finance, right, to create market share internationally, you see with the conversation about value-added chains this summer, a lot of concerns from the US about its own capacity, right? We see a willingness to invest in industrial policy to some extent, early industrial policy, but crafting semiconductor industry, reinvesting in semiconductor industry in the United States, we've seen deals with South Korea over this past summer to have a shared alliance in order to invest and build semiconductor ties directly between South Korea and the United States. And so I think that there's a realization that not only competing with China through private equity is important and subsidizing that to some degree through, credits, but then simultaneously that it's also very important to start to think more holistically about industrial policy, right? We not only see these kind of thoughts coming out of the United States and policies, but also in terms of the UK as well. The difference is now we're seeing a Biden administration using alliances to accomplish this compared to a Trump administration that's primarily going at it bilaterally.
Yeah, the way I usually put that is that we're all becoming a little Chinese, actually, to compete. and so that is interesting. Laura points out that the head of the IADB is from the US for the first time, which is maybe perhaps not insignificant.
Exactly. Yes, completely agree.
So this has been fun. I've learned a lot. I admittedly know so little about Latin America and have appreciated this. And I can't wait to delve deeper into the book, which I have purchased. Well, actually, your publisher sent me a copy, but I encourage people to get out their wallets and buy it. So you're an academic. It's more about getting ideas into the world. And
exactly.
So, we're happy with them to be out there. So please let me express my gratitude to Laura Alfaro and to Stephen Kaplan and to the Dr. Klass and to the Fairbanks Center for co-sponsoring the event. And it will be on YouTube. And we thank you. So there'll be 2 more seminars in the spring, but I haven't scheduled them or announced them yet. And so stay tuned for that. But thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much to both of you for facilitating this and having some great comments and feedback. And thanks to the audience as well.
Great. Congratulations on the book. All right.
Thank you.
All right, team. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're free to go if you need.
Yes.
Welcome to the talk. We'll get started momentarily. Thank you for joining us.
I feel like last time I said it was a job, a practice job.
Yeah.
2011.
Okay. Thanks, Joe, for joining, those of you in person and those of you online. I'm Meg Withmeyer. I'm a former McFarland professor at the Harvard Business School, and I run the China Economy Lecture Series here at the Fairbanks Center. And so today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jonas Nam from the School of Advanced and International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Nam is an assistant professor in the Energy and Environment Department at the SAIS School and is very generously sharing with us today his research on China and the role of climate and clean energy in China and in the US and elsewhere. So Jonas's work, Professor Nam's work, runs a kind of thread through industrial policy, political economy, and a firm-based approach to climate issues. He's going to be sharing material from his book here today. It's called Collaborative Advantage, as you see. Excitingly, the book just won 2 major book awards, the Science and Technology Award for the American Political Science Association and the International Political Economy Award for the International Studies Association, which is very exciting. He's also published in Science and in Nature and in a dozen or so academic journals on issues related to China, the US, China's clean energy policies, as well as issues related to decoupling in the US-China climate relationship. And so we're pleased to have him. So we'll go until 5:30 today, not any time after that. And so he'll talk for a little bit and then we'll do some questions and have a discussion. So thank you, Jonas, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. Since we're sort of in a cozy grouping here, feel free to interrupt me and sort of steer this thing in whichever way is interesting to you. My plan is to sort of briefly kind of talk about the core outcome that the book explains, then explain my argument that Meg is very familiar with because she helped me craft it over many months of text messages and phone calls. And then I wanted to talk about two of the cases, the German and the Chinese case, obviously the China case in it, and then sort of end by thinking a little bit more broadly about what this means for economic decoupling, particularly in the climate space. But I think, since this book was sent off and the manuscript was sent off, I think the decoupling problem has become much broader in a way, or the discussions about it. And so we can maybe sort of think a little bit about what that means for other sectors as well, like biotech and semiconductors. So I'll be calling on you to explain this to us. But let me sort of, before I dive into China, start in the US, right? So this summer, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which may or may not reduce inflation. But it's not really about that. At the core, it's a sort of industrial policy initiative, and in many ways, an industrial policy initiative that, at least in the clean tech spaces, responds to China. And so it's a bill that contains very ambitious local content regulation in order to bring these supply chains back to the US. And these are local content regulations that in many ways are exactly the kinds of local content regulations that the US has fought for many decades in China. And this is not a book about why the US needs to do this now, why it didn't get what it wanted in these industries. But it is a book about sort of how the US ended up in this particular spot in the global division of labor. And that's an argument that I make in the book that we can't really understand without also understanding where China sits in these sectors. And so the answer to these questions, sort of where does America stand, where's Europe in these clean tech industries that are very salient politically and also very attractive to policymakers, really begins in China. And when I started working on this project many years ago, I started really by wanting to understand why China was dominating wind, solar industries at the time. It's now also dominating other clean tech industries like batteries. And in the United States back then, under the Obama administration, the administration had sort of declared that we were now in a clean energy race with China. And it seemed at this time that China was winning very clearly. Solyndra was a big US sort of case of a solar manufacturer that had gone bankrupt with a lot of government money. China was sort of advancing very quickly in these sectors and dominating wind and solar production globally, the components for wind, including in wind turbines that were installed in the United States. And in other parts of the world, there were similar worries. In Germany, there were a much broader discussion at the time about whether the German economy, with the sort of very peculiar German vocational training institutions and financing kind of structures, could be competitive in a global economy that was sort of dominated by China. So these were not just conversations about sort of the structure of supply chain, but really also conversations about sort of the viability of a way of life within that global economy that now was increasingly an economy that China was playing a big role in. When I started doing field work, and so a lot of the book is really about sort of shop floor interviews in factories like the one on this picture, I didn't really find a race at all. And so the project changed very quickly. It was really a project about collaboration between German, Chinese, and American firms in wind and solar sectors that I found sort of working together in these sectors. And so Chinese firms were, of course, very competitive in these industries, but they were not competitive in everything, and they were working with firms from other parts of the world in order to get these technologies to market. And so even if a lot of things said made in China, the solar panels or the wind turbines, they had a lot of ingredients from other parts of the world. And so China's industrial parks really were just centers, sort of central nodes in a division of labor, centers of collaboration, if you will, in this division of labor, and not really the beachheads and sort of an industrial policy race between these different places. And so German firms were, as I then found out, working on customizations with the kinds of automation equipment that Chinese firms were using to produce these technologies. Chinese firms were what I termed innovative manufacturing, sort of the kinds of innovation related to commercialization and rapid scale up to mass production in these industries. And American firms were part of it too. They were really sort of focused on what we would call invention, the sort of Silicon Valley type focus on the kinds of innovation that you need to bring new products to market. And firms were picking these very different specializations in these global industries, even though they were supported domestically with very similar industrial policy tools that sort of combined, on the one hand, kind of technology push incentives, so R&D subsidies, that sort of stuff, and on the other hand, kind of market pull policies that created domestic markets for clean energy technologies at the time. And so we saw very different kinds of industrial specialization, even though the policy environment was very similar, actually, in Germany, China, and the US at the time. I won't go into that in much detail, but China, for instance, copied a lot of the industrial policy tools exactly from other cases, and so there was a lot of similarity. And that was in many ways because there was a similar political logic behind this sort of industrial policy use, right, which started as really open-ended explorations of these new technologies, very quickly became sizable industries. And so governments wanted to not just spend money subsidizing wind and solar domestically, but they wanted to see domestic economic results. And so we sort of saw this convergence of industrial policy goals and industrial policy tools. What we didn't see was a convergence of the kinds of industrial specializations in these sectors. And so wind and solar investment globally grew over time, and not just in rich economies, but in developing economies too. And China made up an increasingly large share. This is China here in the middle, of global investment in these sectors. But firms responded with very different kinds of domestic industrial specializations. For sort of from a political science perspective, it was also interesting, or maybe surprising even, that that these firms picked such different industrialized specializations in these places, because these were all post-globalization industries. And so we had this sort of reorganization of the global economy in the 1990s, China's accession to the WTO in the early 2000s, and then these industries matured afterwards. And so in many ways, there was an opportunity for a break with these existing industrial patterns, and we didn't really see that break. We saw very distinct specializations, even though they were post-industrial, post-globalization sectors, and one of the first post-globalization sectors. And so what we got instead was this division of labor where all sorts of new technologies came to market, and they came to market sort of as a result of a collaboration between these different kinds of companies from different parts of the world. And so the central question that I'm really asking in this book is why firms picked such distinct industrial specializations in the global economy, and defines both of these government goals that in many ways wanted all of these different activities domestically, and then defines also of the sort of industrial policies that actually converged quite a bit across these three economies. And the argument that I make in the book is that globalization itself is responsible for or enables rather these distinct industrial specializations in these different places, and that globalization itself sort of enables this consistent divergence of industrial specializations in different places. And so China and the kind of global economic system that it helped create didn't threaten the kind of German economic practices, but actually enabled Germany to keep doing what they had been doing for a long time, and to refine it and apply it and adjust it for new industrial sectors. And they also sort of in many ways made American industrial specializations more American. And so it kind of reinforced this focus on invention and the sort of traditional kind of strength in many ways of the American system. And so I think to make sense of that argument, we should spend just 1 second kind of thinking about what globalization actually means, and or sort of what we mean by it. And so if globalization is all so if we sort of step back and sort of define globalization, I think different disciplines have very different approaches to it. We can think about globalization as sort of primarily a process of kind of reaping gains from trade based on kind of comparative advantage. And so in that sense, globalization is something like progressive outsourcing. I don't think there's any economists here, so I can sort of attribute that very freely to the economists, and the folks online will just have to deal. There's also globalization that sort of primarily as a process of sort of dealing with the competitive pressures that come from the global economy. I think that's a very political science approach, like how much domestic policymaking autonomy do we still have? Can institutions survive? I think that very much was kind of the German worry about China's rise in the global economy. could Germany survive economically with these institutions that in many ways are sort of, at least decades, but maybe hundreds of years old in a very different environment. And then this sort of perspective, and I don't think either of them are wrong, but I sort of highlight a third perspective in the book that it really sees globalization as a process that is primarily about collaboration. I think that is often missed in these other perspectives. And so if we think about globalization as primarily opening new pathways for collaboration in the global economy, then we can sort of think about collaborative advantage, which is the title of the book and one that Meg came up with on a bike in Harvard Square as we were on the phone at some point a few years ago. So we can think about collaborative advantage as the process through which firms participate in these global production systems and sort of take advantage of the benefits that they can derive from it. And so I argue that there's sort of two benefits that firms get from participating in this global system. The first is that because of these new opportunities for collaboration in the global economy, as a result of the changes that we saw in the 1990s that sort of culminated with China participating, firms can participate in a global division of labor that allows them to specialize. Like they no longer have to do everything. They can focus on very narrow sets of activities and then work with other firms in other parts of the world to get new products to market. And so in order to enter the solar industry, you don't have to know everything about the solar industry. You can do this in a very narrow way. And so collaboration in that sense obviates the need to establish all the skills required to develop, commercialize, and produce new technologies, and instead allows firms to specialize in distinct steps. And so you can contrast that, for instance, with the sort of Ford conglomerates that also own the rubber plants and everything is sort of in one company. This is the opposite of that. You don't need to do that anymore. And so in many ways, that's a kind of the economic manifestation of collaborative advantage. And the second benefit that firms get from participating is that these new possibilities for specialization allow them to work with existing skills and existing domestic institutions. And so these institutions no longer have to support all sorts of activities, but can focus on very distinct and narrow sets of skills. And so firms can repurpose existing institutions for participating in these new industries. And so that's the kind of political manifestation of this argument. And so by allowing firms to specialize and build on these existing domestic skills and existing domestic institutions, globalization enables this persistent and consequential divergence of national industrial specialization. So precisely the kinds of institutions that, for instance, the Germans were worried about would be threatened by China's rise in the global economy survived, I argue, because of China's participation in this division of labor. And so maybe this is a little abstract. So one example, this is one of the companies that I really love, that I visited many times in this process. It's a German sort of small, medium-sized firm, family-owned, was a supplier to the auto industry, eventually entered the solar industry by building on sort of existing knowledge. It added new skills adopted from other industrial sectors, and then developed eventually production equipment for the solar industry. But it did so together with Chinese partners, and so it could only kind of build on these existing German strength and customization, take advantage of the existing German vocational training system and the existing financing institutions, because it had Chinese partners on the other side that created demand for these kinds of products, but also sort of helped in making them possible. And so instead of undermining these traditional economic institutions, I think we see this particularly in Europe, which is why I sort of come back to the German example many times. But these sort of traditional economic institutions that we see in many places, globalization allowed firms to kind of reinvest in them and strengthen them, and also allowed new firms in these new industries to become part of the political coalitions that support these industrial sectors. And that is because these institutions no longer have to support everything. Germany had to just do customization but participate in these sectors while relying on other firms to do other things. And so if we sort of think back to kind of some of the political science literatures on this, what we got was in many ways quite the opposite of a race. it was because of this collaboration in global supply chains that traditional industrial specializations and their underlying kind of economic institutions survived and became part of these new industrial sectors. And China was sort of a very central part in enabling and allowing for that. It was also because of these institutions that wind and solar sort of collectively became mature industrial sectors that are now at the core of kind of climate politics today. And so I'm going to talk through these two cases, Germany and China, as sort of as separate cases, but in many ways we can't really understand them on their own. They are so tightly linked, and then sort of a story that now relates to these questions about decoupling, right? So they're tightly linked in the creation of these sectors places. I think now there's a political push to move away from this kind of integration. And I think there are real debates about whether that's possible, given sort of this complementary set of skills that have existed for a long time in these places that now have to come from elsewhere. So let me just, I know this is the China economy seminar, so I'll start with Germany and then sort of dangle China as the carrot at the very end. But I think Germany is sort of an interesting case, not just because I'm German and I speak German, but also because I think the sort of worry about China and the sort of economic competitiveness in a world dominated by China was particularly acute there. I think people often forget in the early 2000s, Germany had a sort of a very long recession economically. It was kind of the laggard in Europe. And there were a lot of concerns about what globalization would do to this traditional system, especially as China sort of came on board and in many ways started announcing that it would compete with this traditional manufacturing strength of the German economy, right? To this day, I think manufacturing is something like 25% of GDP in Germany, which is a much, much higher share, similar to Japan, but very different from many other economies. And so what I'm arguing essentially is that China helped Germany revive these industrial specializations and make them survive into the future. And so what I'm arguing is that because German small and medium-sized firms could enter wind and solar sectors through collaboration with Chinese partners, they were able to build on these house banks, the kind of German traditional vocational training system, and also kind of R&D institutions that are targeted at small and medium-sized firms that have been around for 70 or 80 years at this point. And that was because of the ability to work with Chinese partners. And so Germany had very similar industrial policies as these other cases. The German kind of market support mechanism was the German feed-in tariff law, and to go too technical there, but the feed-in tariff law was basically copied in China's renewable energy law in 2007. So there was sort of clear also kind of cross-influence in industrial policy making between those two cases. But German firms focused on small-scale customization of production equipment with a high degree of manual labor. These were often family-sized, family-owned businesses making components, production equipment, things that don't have large production runs but are extremely customized for their customers. And so that was kind of the core of the German wind and solar industry for the longest time, and one that I think German politics itself kind of missed. I think there was a lot of discussion about Chinese firms putting German solar plants out of business, but I think sort of the public conversation missed that the majority of jobs and the biggest economic chunk really came from these firms that were working with China. So for instance, one of these firms was founded as a foundry in the 1800s, then made lumber mill saws, that started making manufacturing equipment for furniture making, then got into the semiconductor kind of screen printer space, then kind of merged into the solar equipment space, and started working with Chinese partners from the beginning, because China at the time was automating the solar industry very rapidly because of high labor turnover. And so together, these firms then sort of developed new kinds of equipment for the solar space and won a bunch of efficiency awards. And so it's sort of hard to imagine this trajectory without some of these German institutions, but also without the Chinese partners and the kind of engineering collaboration that happened there. And so they didn't do it alone. For these German wind and solar firms, Chinese partners kind of complemented the German manufacturers, which remained focused on kind of small scale customization and then license things off as soon as larger production runs needed to occur. China provided incentives to develop these targeted wind and solar technologies, these high-end components, the manufacturing equipment, all of that came from China. And China was, as I just said, one of the first places to automate these industries. And so what you see is for the longest time, growing exports from Germany to China. Germany had a trade surplus with China in these sectors for a long time. As a result of these collaborations. I have many anecdotes to talk about these firms and sort of technology examples, but I think I'll save that maybe for a discussion later. Interestingly, though, and I think that's sort of the key point here, is that when I interviewed firms about what enabled them to participate in this collaboration with China, what was the root of this ability to maintain a trade surplus with China in these sectors, they were precisely the kinds of institutions that sort of political science at the time had argued was slowly dying in the German economy. It was precisely the kind of training institutions and the sort of financing institutions that many argued were making the German economy uncompetitive. And instead, what happened is the two sort of nations benefited and kind of grew together. So I think the German kind of economic boom since the early 2000s was very tightly linked to China. And so Germany basically went through the financial crisis in 2009 unscathed. Yes.
Before you move on to China,
Yes.
I want to ask one question. Do you think these synergies were tied as it was because of the Chinese industrial structure at the time? Or as China moved up the value chain, eventually would crowd out these types of synergies? This is part of the policy debate in Germany today, right? Is, was this a temporary synergy that eventually would lead to a crowding out? Versus are these two synergistic industrial structures that eventually will not lead to, right? So I think that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, right, this is a historical picture, but even if the trade war decoupling, supply chain resiliency had never happened, and we just kept playing and moving forward, would we have a continued synergy or we start to see competition as a result of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been, I think the clearest cases to examine are the ones where Chinese firms bought the German manufacturer, and then you look at sort of how this evolved over time, right? And for most of the cases that I've come across, a lot of the R&D that is specific to this kind of customization work, to the components and to the manufacturing equipment, for instance, in robotics, stays in Germany to a large part because that's where you have the kind of workforce that you need. You have a lot of the sort of ecosystem around it that you need. And so, I think there were a lot of concerns about these purchases in Germany at the time, but we haven't really seen kind of a wholesale move of that stuff to China as a result. And so even if they are kind of almost within the same company at this point, you see this sort of division of labor between these two locations continue. And so maybe the German manufacturer will make the first 50 components that need to be tweaked a lot, that have a lot of kind of close interaction between the customer and the manufacturer. Once you figure out the sort of early stuff, China is much better at then tweaking that design to make it mass manufacturable and bring it up to scale. And I think that's what we see still in the examples that I interviewed for this book, but to some extent, even kind of KUKA and sort of the robot firms, Putzmeister, there's like a few other sort of high kind of publicly discussed examples where I haven't seen. I mean, there are many, we've talked about the KUKA case, I guess, for hours separately, and there's lots of things that didn't work out so well there, but they didn't kind of shut down the German location and moved it, because I think they benefit from these institutional advantages that exist in the German case, and that the firms kind of have have been able to use, I think, to build these kind of strategic strength, right? And giving that up, I think, comes at a big cost. And so I think in China, we see kind of the flip side of this, because China was trying to move out of manufacturing at the time, right? And so you had all of the support for manufacturing at the local level, and then you had a central government basically pushing industrial policy that was all about indigenous innovation, kind of moving out of simple manufacturing, and sort of thinking about how to structurally change the domestic economy at the time. And in many ways, sort of concerns about the middle income trap. So we got here, what do we do next? And so you had this kind of contradiction almost between what local governments doing, what central governments were doing, but it was very much about encouraging firms to move up the manufacturing, but ideally move beyond manufacturing and then to push some of the production activities to other parts in Asia. And so what I see in the Chinese case is that the kind of real critical institutions were kind of local government support for manufacturing that allowed firms to really develop these skills and scale and mass production. And I don't mean this in sort of a derogatory way. I think there's a lot of innovation that goes into that. There are R&D teams that work on these things. So, if you visit these companies, it doesn't look that different from sort of a Western R&D institution, but it's focused on sort of how to take technologies maybe invented in an American startup and sort of bring it to mass production. And so China too used very similar kind of national industrial policy frameworks to do this. As I mentioned earlier, some of them directly came from other countries. And so this sort of feed-in tariff idea of subsidizing electricity made with wind and solar was kind of copied on the German law at the time. But what you got from firms was not a focus on the sort of indigenous innovation that the center was pushing, and then Made in China 2025 was pushing, and then the central government was still pushing even when we weren't talking about Made in China 2025 anymore. But what we got was a focus on precisely the kinds of innovation that we need to take these technologies and scale them up to mass production. And so as a result, China basically now accounts for most of the production in these sectors, which isn't because of factor cost advantages. Energy is much cheaper in the US for these industries. So, they're highly automated. You could make the stuff here. A lot of it is about the kind of capabilities and the skills and the sort of engineering schools that surround it that allowed them to do this. So today, China still makes 97% of wafers for the solar industry. It makes more than half of the kind of wind turbine, the cells, like the big sort of metal castings that all the components fit in. There's lots of parts in the supply chain where it's incredibly dominant, like rare earths for magnets. You need a lot of magnets in wind turbines. China makes more than 90% of those. And now also a growing share of lithium-ion batteries. So we sort of expanded into other clean tech industries that are not part of this book, but that luckily for me follow a similar pattern. And the reason why firms focused on this at the time was really because you could buy, license, learn a lot of these other things from other firms in the world, but what you couldn't do is learn the manufacturing part, because no one had actually brought these industries to mass production before. If you drive from Los Angeles to Palm Springs, you see sort of burned out wind turbines on the side of the road. This is from the 1990s, when these were sort of cottage industries, people bolting together stuff in their garage and trying to kind of make energy a new way. This wasn't a very advanced industry with kind of off-the-shelf components and sort of very well-established design principles. And so I think Chinese firms at the time saw an opportunity to do something, but also didn't want to replicate things that they could get through collaboration with others. Why reinvent the wheel? Focus on the stuff that you can't buy in these global chains. And so, of course, they didn't do it alone. They did it sort of in collaboration. And Mark, that's exactly sort of to your point. So Goldwind, for instance, has been, it's one of the big kind of famous Chinese wind manufacturers, beautiful name, so everyone talks about it. It's no longer the biggest, but they very early on started working with Vensis, which is a German company that developed a technology for gearless wind turbines. Gearboxes are very expensive, they break all the time, so they're sort of maintenance intensive, and Vensis has a technology that basically gets rid of the gearbox. They eventually took a direct stake in the company, but the sort of division of labor exists to this day, where the sort of core technology development for this gearbox part is done in Germany, and then China has the expertise to scale it up to mass production in these industries. And so that collaboration endured over time. It also endured, and we no longer have the A63 program for applied technologies, but that was really very much targeted at indigenous innovation at the time. And the government sort of tolerated this ongoing collaboration as long as there was a kind of Chinese brand name at the end on the product. But it wasn't just solely a Chinese thing. And so in order to do that, these firms relied on kind of a host of institutions at the local level in China for mass production that continue to exist to this day. And I think the key the real key sort of innovation here is the kind of financial sector that is willing to fund mass production. And so Chinese firms were able to build with kind of various generous loans, so-called golden lines, so entire manufacturing plants that are only dedicated to research and development purposes. And those financial the loans were basically brokered and often backed by local governments in China at a time when firms in other parts of the world were not getting financing for these new industries that were unproven, still very expensive, and not something anyone wanted to invest in. And so if you look at sort of like their financial filings and their short-term debt, you can see that even after the financial crisis in 2009, these firms were able to raise more money for more investment and capacity. And so this is a real kind of important part of creating an infrastructure for this sort of knowledge and mass production. And as a result, we've had these incredible cost declines of these technologies that have now made solar the cheapest source of energy in many parts of the world. And China kind of a critical contributor to the solution to the climate problem, because we now have these cheap kind of solar technologies. But of course, they also relied on materials from the US. They relied on kind of the German production equipment. This was a joint endeavor, but one that really came together in China and was funded by Chinese development banks and backed by local governments. Didn't always go well, of course, and we can talk about that too. Lots of bankruptcies and sort of bad debt, but that also sort of allowed this particular specialization. And so where does this leave us? So let's shift sort of a little bit to a discussion about economic decoupling, I think. And so in some ways, this book became sort of a historical book in the process of writing it, because the world shifted very much while it was under review. And so, my argument really is that globalization allowed for these distinct specializations, and it was only because of this kind of cross-border exchange and these very tight linkages between firms that firms in different parts of the world could do these things, and that they could kind of revive and maintain these legacy institutions that continue to have value in these new industries. And so it turns out that perhaps globalization itself is the thing we need to save, and not so much these institutions that many worry would die kind of in a globalized economy. And that I think got more acute during the COVID-19 pandemic, because I think there was a lot of uncertainty in global supply chains in many ways that didn't work. So there was kind of a renewed focus on bringing things home. But I think that was just one of many factors. And so kind of tensions in the US-China relationship have sort of pushed us to think about decoupling. The Europeans are thinking about reshoring a lot of these industries. I think in general, there's sort of a different flavor in these, and a new kind of mercantilist trade policy in many ways, kind of taking place around the world. And so, when I talked about the Inflation Reduction Act at the very beginning, I mean, in many ways, this is a very clearly sort of targeted bill that tries to bring manufacturing back from China. In the battery space, for instance, the tax credits that you now get for electric vehicles, you only get if none of the materials that go into the battery are refined or manufactured in China. It's one of the few things we have in this space that actually name a country and sort of say we want to pull it back. And there are all sorts of national security arguments for this, of course, and the political logic that I mentioned at the beginning. But if I'm right with this book and the sort of need to embed these activities in local kind of age-old institutions, then it's going to be very hard to do that. As someone who works on climate and kind of pick these clean energy sectors for that reason, that makes me worried, because it's going to be very hard to decouple in the time frame that we have left to fix the kind of decarbonization issue. And so there might be long-term stuff that you can do to rejiggle these supply chains and kind of reshape them globally. But if emissions have to peak well before 2030 in order to kind of avert the worst sort of climate consequences, then we don't have much time to do that. And so for now, meeting these climate goals will require collaboration. With China. It still makes 2/3 of the solar panels, even though the US has long had trade remedies in place to try to shift these supply chains to other parts of Asia. It makes most of the wind turbines in the world. It's one of the largest. I think the EU just kind of hold even with China market for electric vehicles, and it makes most of the batteries that go into these electric vehicles. And so we see this now in kind of new sectors playing out very similar things: American battery chemistries, German production equipment, Chinese loans, bringing these different entrepreneurs together in China and then rapidly expanding the production scale of lithium ion manufacturing in China. And so there's a little bit of activity sort of up here as countries are throwing a lot of public money at trying to reshape these supply chains, but it's a slow process. And actually a lot of the raw materials that then go into batteries that are manufactured here or in Europe are still refined in China, because China is the only place that knows how to do it at the moment. And so maybe one way to think about it is sort of a more conscious collaboration approach that can combine these two things. I don't think decoupling is the solution. I also think it's unreasonable to think that all of these technologies need to be brought in from elsewhere if they're subsidized and sort of made possible with domestic regulation. And so maybe it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, and we can do both at the same time. Can we, in the short run, accept that there are few alternatives to this division of labor that has benefited American startups and European firms, but also benefited Chinese manufacturers? And in the long term, still invest in a different kind of competitiveness and different kinds of institutions here to support different kinds of economic activity. And that would mean learning from China, actually, more than trying to keep China out. So maybe thinking about a national development bank for manufacturing, as has been proposed in the past but never passed. And so these are sort of the two levers, I think, in this moment. So I guess he and Biden are talking again. The climate talks might sort of be back on track. But I think we're still very far from sort of trying to combine these things. And for now, it's a very zero-sum game. And so with that, thank you for sticking around. Let's have a conversation.
Great, thank you. So I see the questions rolling in online. I'm going to come up so I can see them.
Okay.
Is that okay? Or do you want to look at them yourself? I'll come up so that I can see that. But let me just take my privilege by asking the first question here, as long as no one minds, which is basically the security question in one way, which is like so the argument, right, about sometimes about decoupling is sometimes about dual use technologies and espionage, et cetera, right? I don't think that's the argument people make, right, about some of the clean technologies. But then the argument that people make then is about economic coercion or weaponization or withdrawal, right, of supplies. And so if we live in a world where, you showed the statistics on China making, 35% of this and 55% of that, is that a dangerous world, especially when we think about rare earths and lithium and batteries, et cetera? So what do you say about things like that from people?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated field. Joanna Lewis and Michael Davidson and Alex Wong, a few people, we wrote this piece for Science this year where we try to kind of pull apart these different security logics and actually go through what the economic and the kind of national security risks are.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some, right? So for instance, for wind turbines, there's a lot of fleet management that happens. You could technically hack into the software and sort of take control of these wind parks. But if we're worried about that, then we should be worried about every single power plant in this country, which also is not very well protected.
Right.
I think in the battery space, there's concern about the kind of manufacturing skill, and a lot of the military technology now uses batteries. Like it's all like battery-driven drones and automatic this and that. And so there's some concerns there. But I think a lot of the thinking comes from the 1970s oil shocks, where the tankers stopped coming and the country sort of fell apart without energy. And the difference in these technologies is that the solar panels are still going to work, even if we go to war with China tomorrow, right? Like the ones that are already here are not just going to expire because of sort of geopolitical circumstances. So there's supply chain risk, and it's probably not a smart idea to rely on one place for such a high share, but it is sort of qualitatively, I think, a different context because what's already here is going to keep working. But I think it's sort of a problem that we now see. I think people are tuned now to the supply chain risk, and it turns out we were actually probably unaware of how concentrated some of the production was. For many things, including semiconductors, right, where certain minerals are just mined in China and they're absolutely essential. So it can be like these tiny little bottlenecks. And so I think there's more of an effort now to kind of spread things out and diversify these supply chains. And I think that's, that's a valid argument to make. And also one that doesn't really actually mean we have to pull anything out of China, because these markets are growing so rapidly. Everyone can kind of add to their share of the pie, and no one has to really lose out in that sense. But yes, there's some security vulnerability in that sense, but I think it's mostly a supply chain vulnerability, and sort of question would China be willing to weaponize it in that way.
I have other questions, but I'm sure other people do as well. So before we turn online, I'll see if anyone who can. So Minya was asking about the difference between wind and solar, basically, I think was the thrust of her question. I'm probably not doing it justice, but you can check and see if you want.
The difference between
how those value chains work, right? So, I mean, if there is a difference.
Yeah, so the value chains are very differently organized. Wind is more clustered. There's sort of global clusters. You do a lot more production near the kind of installation side because they're very heavy to ship. Solar only has a few steps and they're not that difficult to ship. They're standardized, they fit into containers, and so you can make everything in China and then ship it around the world. In terms of this kind of division of labor, though, I see a very similar pattern, even though the supply chains look quite different. Because in the wind industry, there's sort of lead plants that do a lot of the innovation. And so, for instance, in the componentry, you see this sort of collaboration between German and Chinese firms. The components can be shipped, and then the sort of final assembly might be somewhere else, but that's not really where the collaboration sort of on the innovation side happens. And so I think the collaboration sort of exists in both sectors. It looks slightly different. It's embedded in different supply chains that sort of have different characteristics simply because of the physical features of these plants. And so in wind, we're a lot less afflicted by these security concerns that you mentioned, because you can basically shift production because there are clusters all around the world to do this. But cutting China out of it would also make things more expensive because they have, done a lot of innovation on trying to kind of get the cost of componentry down and develop kind of innovative solutions for that.
I have a big question. We're seeing more pop up online, so you might want to check. But if China is so good at mass manufacturing wind and solar parks, and they have such capacity at doing it, why do they build new coal plants domestically all the time? What, and what will it take basically to get China domestically to reduce? I mean, I know you think about this stuff all the time, but like, what is the path through which we get emissions peaking in China by 2030, and then?
I mean, the cool thing is, so at the most basic level, I think what we need to change in China is the kind of incentivization of basically any kind of activity through GDP and kind of economic growth, right? And so you see this competition between different provinces. The problem with, the benefit with coal is you can build a coal power plant anywhere and it can create local economic activity. I mean, if the price of coal is such that you can make money with it. If you do wind and solar, a lot of the wind and solar resources are like in Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. So you have to buy power from other parts of the country. But that means Shanghai is essentially giving GDP to other parts of the country, and it doesn't count towards your own goals anymore, right? And so China doesn't have yet really a national power market. It's moving in that direction. There are pilots and all sorts of stuff. Companies can do these direct purchase agreements and so on. But for the most part, power trading between provinces is still determined administratively. And so in that system, sometimes coal makes a lot more kind of political sense from kind of an incentive structure than these other things. And I mean, power sector reform has been, on the books really as a goal for almost 10 years at this point, and very little has actually kind of materialized. And so the flip side is not just that we build these coal power plants, keep building them, but also that sometimes all the wind that's being produced in sort of the interior can't be exported because there's no buyers for it. And so it just goes to waste. In some provinces, 30% of it goes to waste. So, Yes, and I think it's a sort of interesting time because China for the longest time has had such rapidly increasing energy demand. So you could build more coal and also more solar and wind, and everyone would get more. But I think that's changing now. The economy, obviously is cooling, and power demand is also not rising anymore. And so now any new additions of these new technologies are sort of causing direct distributional battles between the owners of the old stuff and the owners of the new stuff. And they're often kind of, administrative units in the same government.
Thank you, Anne, for Minya's question.
Any questions here? Otherwise, I'll talk.
I'm
Yes.
happy to ask away, and like, I think you'll probably have questions too. But I just want to make sure others have a chance to ask. So I guess this is the China economy lecture series. So this makes sense. Obviously, we're trying to look at maximization from a welfare or an enhanced welfare externality, including environmental externality and so on and so forth. But I just want to throw out a different exercise, right? Which is similar to the answer you just gave to Meg about coal and so forth. If the US or Germany's goal is not so much to maximize efficiency or sort of welfare units and as externality unit as we considered it, but instead was to maximize employment. Or let's put it differently, assign a different externality weight to full employment as opposed to lagged employment, and with the spillover externalities from knowledge creation and so on and so forth. How would this change the analysis in terms of what type of collaboration you would want to formulate or not, right? In other words, what I sense going on in the policy debate is not just about supply chain resiliency, national security, along the question that Meg is posing, but also a renewed debate on both the left and right about what's the right unit of analysis for maximization from an economic welfare function. So I just wanted you to sort of maybe posit, right, if we accepted a different unit of analysis of what we're trying to maximize, how would that change the analysis here? And in some ways, I feel like the argument of the book and the argument that you're giving in the talk is China, US, and Germany each have a slightly different welfare maximization formula, right, that it's using, which has led to a collaborative advantage in the global economy. But that equation is being rethought in both the US and Germany. So I just wanted to invite you to sort of comment, particularly since we're in the economy series here, on thinking and along those lines.
I mean, I think if I can talk about the US for a second, I think the US is sort of a really difficult case for all of this, because in some ways, the US historically is the biggest investor in R&D in these industries and sort of is foundational to a lot of the technologies that I'm talking about in this book, but also the new stuff that's coming out. And this particular specialization in the US, which I didn't talk about in the talk, but which is one of essentially having excellent research universities and an excellent kind of infrastructure for spinning off technology into startups, is one that benefits from this incredible public investment in R&D, but also yields the least kind of economic footprint on the ground directly, right? The footprint that we get in the US is through China, right? So like these technologies are developed here, they're then sort of commercialized collaboratively in China, and then they come back. And then we have these large service industries domestically that employ a lot of people that install them and maintain them, and do all those things. And I think politically that doesn't really play well in the US, because we have this very irrational obsession with manufacturing, which is the one part that the US kind of specialization doesn't get. So one way of changing sort of welfare maximization in that sense would be to improve the service sector jobs in these industries, and sort of also be more realistic about the manufacturing industry in these industries looks like. Solar manufacturing is almost entirely automated. Nobody works there. And battery manufacturing also is very low on kind of employment. I mean, batteries are manufactured in kind of dry rooms where the humidity is so low that people can only be in there for kind of 15 minutes at a time and need to be shifted. this is not like, thousands of people having union jobs in a double garage and sort of 1950s American manufacturing. And so I think that's a political problem in a way. But that political problem, of course, is now driving how countries are thinking about this and pushing kind of a reorganization of these supply chains that I think is going to make it more expensive and difficult to get a lot of this stuff on the ground in the timeline that we need to get it in the ground in order to fix the climate problem. And so that's kind of how I think about it. But I also think it's not entirely unreasonable that you want some manufacturing and some sort of industrial capabilities to happen domestically. The problem with the American approach is that basically sort of the way that we think in this country about R&D is really kind of hasn't changed since the post-war decades. And so it's a sort of funnel type system, right? You pour money into basic research and then it eventually trickles out into the economy and creates domestic industries. And that still happens, except those industries are no longer here because collaboration in global supply chains allows these industries to spring up in places that are much better equipped to do that. And so I think the system is sort of broken in that sense, but we haven't really kind of adapted our expectations or our way of funding things. And so that's kind of what's coming to a head now with some of these new policies here, which I think are good. The problem is that I think we should be learning from China more. If we really want to do more manufacturing, we need to figure out who's paying and financing and giving loans for these plans. And so the Inflation Reduction Act creates local content requirements, but then doesn't actually offer any of the kinds of institutions that firms get in China in order to meet these local content requirements. So that's a different talk, but we are now kind of in the US very clearly linking our climate ambition to industrial development outcomes without really having tested whether we're actually capable of meeting those industrial development targets. And so we could be out for kind of a surprise if none of these goals are being met. No one gets the tax credits because China just happens to be better at doing this stuff, and we haven't really figured out how to compete on that scale.
Further down, there might be some more questions further down.
So I think that also just answered the first question there. Yeah, I think the last question is exactly sort of what I mean. I mean, I think there is a sort of shift here, right? And in many ways, that shift makes a lot of sense. But I think it's a game of different timelines. Like, can you actually mount kind of a productive response to this without kind of cutting the relationship, early? Mm-hmm. And I also think that kind of there's a sort of idea that you can actually be autonomous, and I think that's a total myth. We're seeing this in the semiconductor industry where once you start digging, I mean, there's so many suppliers that are needed for the production equipment that have 95, 100% of global market share for that one particular product that they make. And I think that the OEMs are actually not very well aware of where those supply chain bottlenecks are, which is why they're being caught by these surprises when we have a global crisis and we get this sort of situation where no one can buy a car because some kind of mineral that you need to make a plastic for manufacturing equipment then kind of stops chip manufacturing for these cars. So I think governments would like it to be more competitive. I think firms are much more comfortable with continued collaboration. I think we're seeing that play out in the German case as well, where there's a lot of criticisms, and then the German chemical manufacturers go and say, okay, we're spending $15 billion this year on the plants in China. So they continue to work on this collaborative kind of pattern. But there's definitely a tension now. And I don't think we'll ever get to a world where it's like everything can be within national borders. I think it'll always be a combination of both. But from a political perspective, I also think if we want to keep going in this direction, we have to show some political results domestically and some jobs. And so it can't be one, either or in that sort of absolutist way. And so there'll be more competition. And I think that's maybe also motivating, and some collaboration will continue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Scary. It's a scary future, actually, but we'll see.
I also don't think that there's anything fixed about this. I'm picking on these three countries because they're sort of very stylized examples of how it works. There are other collaborative relationships between other countries that have a similar kind of mechanism. And we're also now seeing it more and more in these legacy sectors, like so EVs looks a lot like wind and solar because of batteries. Yeah. But traditionally, the auto sector maybe didn't really look like that because we had sort of the Rust Belt and a lot of manufacturing in Michigan. And so there was a different global division of labor. So I think in some ways, this is now quite ingrained in the global economy. And so there's this current fad of saying we can redirect supply chains and do everything domestically. And I think that's likely going to be much harder than governments think.
Because in an ideal world, we want both jobs and to limit emissions to find a way. And so it seems like I guess what I'm taking away is that some of those goals trade off with one another.
Yes, and there's also an underappreciation for what China's bringing to the table, right? I think there's a sort of conversation in the West about cheap inputs, and this is just about scale and kind of, essentially throwing cheap energy and labor at this stuff. And I think there's a lot of know-how in these sectors.
I mean, there's definitely a trade-off between speed of environmental climate change adaptation technology, and particularly the adaptation technology that people are missing, right? Yeah. And the cost of that versus supply chain resiliency and jobs for advanced economies.
Right. And it's interesting, like you would change your welfare unit if it were, maximizing efficiency of toys, right? Which is different than maximizing efficiency of deploying effective, solar panels, I guess.
Yeah, so that's why I asked about right, if you change the maximization function, right, then the optimal point, right, is a little bit different. But it's at the end of the day, it's an ideological political choice. I feel like we're making between balancing these competing priorities. To pretend we can do both is a little bit
There is also there's a couple of really interesting political science papers that essentially argue that these industries are politically also very salient because people associate them with the future. And so, even the Trump administration picked trade wars with China on solar, even though that administration in particular had very little interest in bringing solar back to the US. But because these industries are sort of politically getting a lot of attention, if you're going to choose a sector within which to argue this stuff, washing machines just doesn't get you the same kind of political attention. And so, unfortunately, these are sectors where we need these relationships, but they're also more vulnerable politically because of sort of the way that they're being perceived and talked about publicly. They're the closest we have to kind of strategic industries here now. And so I think people are a lot more attuned.
Big problems. Lots of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the book too, which teaches us a lot about how we got to the point where